The morning of December 7th, 1941, began as any other, still, quiet, almost serene, on the Pacific Ocean. As dawn's light crept across the water, the men aboard the USS Enterprise had no sense of the storm that was about to break upon them. A carrier in the midst of a long patrol, the Enterprise was thousands of miles from Pearl Harbor, where the Japanese had launched their devastating attack. The fleet that had been stationed there was now engulfed in flames, but Enterprise, by a mere twist of fate, was not among them. Its absence would prove to be the very thing that changed the Pacific War's early trajectory. In a world where precision and timing ruled, the Enterprise had avoided the fate of its sister ships, slipping past the waves of destruction by mere hours. Analysts would later quietly agree the Enterprise's survival was no accident. It was a strategic blessing for America, a weapon that would tip the balance in the Pacific when the scales seemed irreversibly tilted. As the ship's crew returned to Pearl Harbor, what awaited them was a scene of devastation that few could truly comprehend. The harbor, once a symbol of strength, was now a smoldering ruin, a graveyard of American naval power. The air was thick with acrid smoke, the waters streaked with oil, and the faces of those who disembarked wore expressions that could only be described as stunned disbelief. Among them, the question loomed quietly but urgently. What now? They had lost so much, but they still had the Enterprise. What would they do with it now, with everything changed? A ship designed for deterrence had become, by happenstance, the last remaining instrument of American power in the Pacific. Its role had shifted from defense to survival, and now to retaliation. The Enterprise was no longer just another asset in the fleet. It had become the linchpin of a fledgling American offensive. Its survival was not just a stroke of luck. It was a grim realization. The war would continue, and this ship would lead the way. But even as the men of the Enterprise stood on its deck, surveying the destruction around them, the question remained unanswered. Could one ship, one carrier, truly turn the tide? It was a question no one could answer, but one that would soon shape the course of history. In the coming months, an answer would begin to emerge, but no one could predict how the Enterprise's next mission would lead them into the heart of a battle that would change everything. With the flames of Pearl Harbor still smoldering in the minds of those who had witnessed the attack, the Enterprise set sail once more. Its decks were now weighted with more than just the burden of its mission. It carried the heavy responsibility of being the last operational fleet carrier left in the Pacific. For the United States, it was no longer just a ship. It was the pivot on which the entire Pacific resistance would turn. Where once Enterprise had been one of many, now it stood alone, a singular bulwark against the relentless tide of Japanese expansion. The Admiralty quickly recognized the ship's new role. They knew the stakes had shifted, that Enterprise was no longer just part of a naval strategy, it was the key. Every decision, every maneuver now mattered on a level they could scarcely admit. The carrier was not only a vessel. It had become the embodiment of American willpower in the Pacific. Its every action carried with it the weight of vengeance and survival. Those aboard felt this too, though few spoke of it directly. It was understood in the quiet moments before dawn, in the weight of their orders. The Enterprise was the ship that had survived, and now it was the ship that would fight. For the crew, the training became all-consuming. They drilled with an intensity born of fear, the fear that one mistake could erase everything. For the pilots, this fear took on a sharp, visceral form. Each day, they memorized Japanese aircraft silhouettes, their eyes learning to see the subtle differences between an enemy fighter and a friend. The stakes were inescapable. One wrong move in the heat of battle, and the Enterprise would become another casualty of war. There was no room for error. The survival of the ship, and perhaps the future of the Pacific, depended on their precision. The Enterprise began to take on a new, almost mythical status. On the surface, it was just a ship, but beneath, it was an indomitable symbol of American resolve. It sailed through the Pacific as a lone piece on an enormous chessboard, each move carrying with it the promise of either victory or annihilation. And though the men aboard seldom voiced it, there was a shared understanding. Every action taken by the Enterprise was a step toward either redemption or despair. Then came the orders for its first retaliatory strikes. They were modest, far from the all-out offensive the Americans dreamed of, but symbolically massive. It was a first step toward reclaiming the Pacific, a quiet but undeniable statement that the United States was not broken. But as Enterprise steamed forward, the question lingered. Would these first strikes, modest as they were, be enough to change the course of the war? And somewhere in the heart of Japan, their response was already taking shape. The Enterprise set sail again, this time with a new mission, to strike back. But in the early days of the Pacific War, these strikes were marked by improvisation and uncertainty. The Navy, still reeling from the disaster at Pearl Harbor, was learning on the fly. Pilots, who had once trained for far different battles, now found themselves engaging a formidable enemy with limited experience and even fewer resources. Their first targets were isolated Japanese positions, scattered across the Pacific like distant, unimportant dots on a map. Yet these small victories, achieved with a mixture of courage and desperation, carried an outsized psychological weight. Each successful strike, no matter how modest, was a burst of light in the murk of uncertainty. For the men aboard Enterprise and for the wider American public, these first retaliatory actions were far more than military operations. They were symbols of resilience, the first flickers of hope after a blow that had shattered their sense of invulnerability. The strikes were psychological as much as they were tactical. As the pilots returned to their ship, their faces tired but triumphant, a shared understanding settled over the crew. It wasn't over. They were still in the fight. But for every small victory, there was an undeniable reality. Intelligence reports began flooding in, each one more troubling than the last. Japan's expansion was outpacing even the most pessimistic predictions. The noose was tightening. Islands fell one by one, and American forces found themselves increasingly stretched thin, unable to counter the Japanese momentum in any meaningful way. The Enterprise was needed more than ever, but its resources were still limited, and so were its options. The admirals, in hushed tones, debated their next steps. Could they slow the Japanese juggernaut with only a handful of carriers, each still working to rebuild from the damage done at Pearl Harbor? It was clear that Enterprise was now the primary blade in America's attempt to blunt Japan's advance. As it launched strike after strike, its crew began to learn something fundamental. Every sortie, every mission, taught them something they hadn't known a month earlier. The Navy was evolving with a speed born of necessity, forced to adapt or be swept away. The pilots became more precise, the tactics sharper. The Enterprise, once a symbol of chance, was becoming something else entirely, a weapon of focused intent. But even as the Enterprise's engines roared through the Pacific skies, there were questions that loomed larger than the battles they were fighting. Was it enough? Could this carrier, this fleet, truly change the course of a war that seemed to be spiraling beyond control? The answers, for now, remained elusive. And as Enterprise prepared for its next strike, a new challenge was emerging, one that would test everything they had learned so far. In the early spring of 1942, the Enterprise found itself in the midst of an operation that would become one of the most iconic moments in the Pacific theater. The ship's role, as an escort for the Doolittle Raiders, marked a pivotal moment in the war, one that forever altered the perception of naval power. For the first time, a carrier was about to prove that it could not only project force in distant seas, but also strike directly at the heart of Japan itself. As B-25 bombers lumbered off the Enterprise's deck, each one an uneasy balance of weight and speed, the crew watched with a sense of disbelief. There was a quiet recognition that history was shifting beneath their feet, that their ship was now part of something greater than any of them could fully understand. The bombing raid on Tokyo, though modest in its immediate tactical impact, reverberated far beyond the damage it inflicted. It was the first American assault on Japanese soil, a demonstration that no place, no matter how distant, was beyond the reach of American power. The psychological shock to Japanese leadership was immediate and profound. Their response, though swift, was overblown, an overreaction fueled by wounded pride. In the wake of the raid, Japanese fleet operations became more erratic, driven less by strategy and more by a desire to restore honor and dominance. This shift would prove to be a pivotal moment in the unfolding battle for the Pacific. The Enterprise had not just escorted bombers into enemy airspace, it had altered the calculus of war, forcing the Japanese to rethink their plans in ways they hadn't anticipated. As the Enterprise returned to port after the mission, it found itself showered with admiration, both from the military and the public. The ship had now become more than just a symbol of American naval power. It was a myth in the making. It was no longer simply a carrier. It was the embodiment of resilience and defiance. Strategists, eager for any advantage after the dark days following Pearl Harbor, began to believe more fervently that naval air power could indeed reverse the tide of the war. The Enterprise had become the spearhead of this belief, an unyielding force that could push back against the seemingly unstoppable Japanese advance. Yet, even as the Enterprise's aura grew, so too did the myths surrounding it. The ship became a symbol, its decks and crew elevated in the public imagination. It stood as a testament to American resolve, the carrier that had defied the odds and taken the fight to Japan. But the truth was far more complex. Beneath the grandeur of its reputation, the Enterprise remained vulnerable, its armor thin, its crew overworked, its systems stretched to their limits. The myth of invincibility had begun to take root, but the ship itself was still a fragile entity, one that had survived not through perfection, but through an unwavering will to press forward. As the Enterprise sailed on, its legacy continued to grow. Yet, in the shadows of its rising fame, the questions remained. How long could this icon of resilience endure? And how long before the relentless tide of war began to erode even the strongest of symbols? In the coming months, a new test awaited the Enterprise, one that would challenge everything it had come to represent. In the quiet precision of intelligence gathering, a breakthrough shifted the momentum of the Pacific War. American codebreakers working tirelessly in the shadows had managed to crack the Japanese naval codes. Suddenly, the fog of war was pierced, and Admiral Chester W. Nimitz was able to foresee the enemy's next move. This intelligence would provide the foundation for an audacious plan to strike first, to ambush the Japanese at Midway. The Enterprise, already a symbol of resilience, was to be placed at the heart of this bold operation. Its role was no longer simply to respond to attacks, but to deliver the decisive blow that would alter the course of history. In the days leading up to the battle, the pilots aboard the Enterprise rehearsed their attacks against theoretical Japanese carriers. The training was grueling, but the purpose was clear: to be ready for the unknown. Every maneuver, every calculated move in the sky was aimed at a target they had yet to see but knew would be waiting for them. Confidence began to rise in the ranks. A feeling that perhaps, for the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Americans were taking the fight to the Japanese with the kind of certainty that comes from knowing the enemy's plans. Yet, even as hope stirred, everyone understood the fragility of their position. The odds were still long. They were still outnumbered. The risk, as always, was immense. On the Enterprise, beneath the steady hum of its engines, there was a different kind of tension. The ship's engineering crews worked around the clock, repairing, maintaining, ensuring that the vessel would be battle-ready for the fight ahead. The rhythm of their labor was a quiet testament to the fragility of their situation. Every hour spent in preparation was an hour that brought them closer to an encounter that could either bring victory or bring them to the brink of destruction. The crew knew that the Enterprise had to be perfect in its execution. There would be no room for failure. As the officers sat in the wardroom, the conversations turned toward the weight of the moment. There was talk of risk, of fate, of what it meant to carry the expectation of an entire nation. The Enterprise was no longer just a ship. It was a symbol, a living embodiment of the country's hope for victory. And with that hope came an unbearable pressure. The men aboard understood, perhaps better than anyone, that their next mission would decide not just their fate, but the future of the entire Pacific theater. It was a collective understanding that haunted them, unspoken but ever present. As the Enterprise sailed toward the meeting at Midway, there was no fanfare, no celebration. There was only the knowledge that they were about to face the greatest test of their lives. They were sailing into the unknown, and yet they carried with them the full weight of expectation. The Pacific's future, it seemed, rested on their shoulders. But what they didn't know was that the battle they were about to fight would reveal more than the strength of their resolve. It would expose the limits of their confidence. In the sky above, a storm was already gathering. The morning of June 4th, 1942, dawned heavy with expectation as Enterprise launched its scout planes into the vast, uncertain skies above Midway. The battle to come was nothing short of historic, the stakes so high that even the slightest misstep could prove catastrophic. The pilots, skilled but inexperienced in the chaos of full-scale naval warfare, knew they were walking a razor's edge. The Enterprise was not just launching planes, it was launching the hope of a nation. Yet, in the vast emptiness of the Pacific, uncertainty ruled. The scouts set out, their missions vague, the skies unfamiliar, and the enemy yet unseen. It was the beginning of a sequence of events that would test both American resolve and the limits of their intelligence. As the hours stretched on, miscommunications began to ripple through the operation. Delays mounted, pilots struggled to find their bearings, and the carefully laid plans started to unravel. The Enterprise had positioned itself as the spearhead of this assault. But now, in the heat of the battle, its pilots were scrambling to make sense of shifting coordinates and diminishing fuel. With every passing minute, the chance of failure grew. Time was running out, and the very success of the ambush seemed to be slipping away. The stakes had never felt higher, and yet, in those fleeting moments, nothing seemed certain. But then, as if fate had chosen to smile on them, the dive bomber squadrons, their fuel reserves nearly exhausted, finally found the Japanese fleet. It was a moment of pure chance, a twist of luck amid the uncertainty. The pilots, exhausted but resolute, dropped their bombs on the enemy carriers with deadly precision. In a series of deafening explosions, the Japanese ships Akagi and Kaga erupted in flames, their decks consumed by the destructive force of American firepower. What had begun as a calculated gamble now crystallized into undeniable victory. The belief in American naval power, once a fragile hope, had become reality in the span of mere minutes. But victory came at a cost. Enterprise, though untouched for the moment, had been targeted by Japanese counterstrikes. The carrier dodged a series of devastating attacks, the bombs falling too close for comfort, the explosions so near that the very air seemed to shudder with the force. Once again, the Enterprise's survival seemed to hang by the thinnest of threads, dependent not on strategy, but on the same chaotic force that had brought it success: chance. The ship's crew, already worn from days of preparation and tension, realized how fragile their victory truly was. For all the triumph of the day, they had narrowly avoided disaster. As the battle drew to a close and the smoke began to clear, the Enterprise and the American fleet stood victorious. The Japanese momentum had been shattered in a single afternoon. The sky, once filled with the sound of gunfire and explosions, was now quiet. But amidst the victory, a sobering truth began to settle over the crew. The war was far from over. Midway had delivered a stunning blow to the Japanese fleet, but the struggle in the Pacific was far from decided. The Enterprise had won a battle, but it had not won the war. The crew knew that, for all their success, the fight ahead would be longer, harder, and far more uncertain than they had yet realized. The Enterprise sailed away from Midway, its decks still echoing with the sounds of combat, but with a sense of profound uncertainty hanging in the air. What had been gained that day was undeniable, but it was only the first chapter in a war that would stretch on for years to come. The future remained unwritten. And as the Enterprise steamed into the horizon, another battle was already taking shape. As Enterprise entered the brutal Solomon Islands campaign in mid-1942, it found itself in the most volatile waters of the war. The skies over the Pacific became a battleground, the carrier now a primary target for a relentless barrage of enemy aircraft. For the crew, each day began with the knowledge that the odds of survival were narrowing. The rhythm of the war had changed. The Enterprise was no longer just a symbol of American strength. It was now at the center of one of the most unforgiving fronts in the conflict. The stakes were no longer strategic. They were personal, immediate, and devastating. Air raids came daily, and each attack pushed the pilots and gunners to the edge of exhaustion. The carrier, its engines roaring to life at all hours, became a constant drumbeat of tension. The constant barrage of enemy planes and bombs blurred the line between strategy and survival. The toll on the crew was visible in their faces, tired eyes, gritted teeth, and the weight of endless vigilance pressing down on them. Yet there was no reprieve. The planes would come, the bombs would fall, and each time the ship's hull shuddered under the impact, the crew had no choice but to press on, knowing that each strike was a step closer to either victory or annihilation. Damage control became a near religion aboard Enterprise. When bombs found their mark, the response was immediate, a frantic rush to contain the fires, patch the holes, and restore the ship to battle readiness. The crew was trained to respond without hesitation, their hands moving faster than their thoughts, driven by a primal need to preserve what they had left. Yet despite their best efforts, Enterprise absorbed more punishment than it was ever designed to withstand. Enemy torpedoes, their warheads glinting in the sun, narrowly missed the ship on several occasions, and shrapnel from explosions took its toll, carving into the ship's structure and leaving wounds that would take days, sometimes weeks, to heal. Yet, with each passing attack, the Enterprise seemed to grow stronger. It adapted. It endured. As the war pressed on, crack teams aboard Enterprise developed new techniques in firefighting and damage control, often inventing solutions mid-battle. It was a testament to the ship's resilience and the ingenuity of those who served aboard it. Every time the ship was hit, the crew found a way to fight back. They learned to work in unison, moving like an organism, its pulse quickening with each successful repair, each fire extinguished, each inch of damaged hull patched. They were not just reacting to the war around them. They were actively reshaping the ship into a weapon that could outlast anything the enemy threw at it. This process of constant adaptation, of learning and surviving, transformed Enterprise into something more than just a warship. It became the most experienced ship afloat, its crew honed in battle after battle. The experience of the Solomon Islands was etched into the very steel of the ship, and its reputation began to grow. The Enterprise was no longer a symbol of potential. It was a symbol of survival, of endurance, of sheer willpower. It had become a ship that, against all expectations, could weather anything. Yet, even as its reputation soared, so did the danger. The true cost of this experience, however, was not immediately apparent. The ship and its crew had endured beyond what anyone could have predicted. But what they didn't know was that the war was about to test them in ways they had never anticipated, ways that would force them to confront their own limits. As the Enterprise limped into the next phase of the campaign, the crew could sense it. Too, their survival was no longer guaranteed. And with every new battle, the question lingered in the air. How long could this unbreakable ship endure? In the coming weeks, they would soon face a test that would push the Enterprise further than it had ever been. The battle for survival aboard the Enterprise was a daily exercise in ingenuity. Constant damage forced the crew to perform improvisations that would redefine naval resilience. With every passing hour, it became clear that the Enterprise was not just enduring the war. It was becoming a living testament to adaptation. Each attack brought new challenges, and with each new challenge came a need for immediate solutions. Engineers working in the ship's darkened and cramped spaces began to think beyond traditional fixes. They adapted arrestor cables to compensate for the wear and tear of daily use, patched armor with whatever materials they could scrounge, and reconfigured fuel lines in ways that had never been anticipated. The battle against the enemy was, in some ways, secondary to the battle against the ship's own frailty. Yet, it was through this very struggle that the Enterprise began to take on a new form, a floating laboratory of wartime innovation. Every part of the ship became a site of invention. Pilots, for their part, were not simply flying. They were learning. They adapted their attack patterns in response to the evolving tactics of the Japanese aerial assault. The Enterprise's pilots were no longer just following orders. They were thinking, evolving in real time, and refining their approach to combat. Every sortie was a lesson learned, every strike a chance to correct past mistakes. The Japanese, with their formidable skills and calculated precision, had pushed the Americans to evolve faster than they ever had before. Each new encounter demanded that the pilots not just respond to the enemy, but anticipate it. They honed their skills as much by observation and adaptation as by training. As the war progressed, the leadership aboard Enterprise began to change. Younger officers, many of whom had never experienced the horrors of battle until now, rose to the occasion. The brutal necessities of war had forged them into decisive, resourceful leaders. The rigid military structures that might have once governed them now seemed to bend and shift, giving way to a more fluid kind of leadership, one born from the heat of battle and the necessity to survive. The officers knew that the ship's survival depended on a collective effort, one in which rank mattered less than the ability to act quickly, think on your feet, and make split-second decisions under pressure. In the absence of tradition, they were carving out a new kind of military culture, one shaped by necessity rather than hierarchy. Amidst the chaos of battle, the ship's intelligence teams worked quietly but effectively, scouring wreckage from downed enemy planes and analyzing every scrap of debris they could find. With each piece of Japanese technology they recovered, the engineers, tacticians, and analysts on board began to understand the enemy's advancements. It wasn't just a matter of keeping the ship afloat, it was a matter of staying ahead. Every scrap of enemy material was treated as intelligence, an opportunity to learn, to innovate, and to prepare for the next strike. The process of salvaging wreckage, of pulling the enemy's secrets from the twisted remains of their own aircraft, became another form of adaptation, one that allowed the Enterprise to evolve even in the face of destruction. The sheer necessity of survival turned the Enterprise into something more than just a warship. It became a floating workshop, a testbed for new ideas, and a proving ground for tactical and technological innovation. Every corner of the ship was occupied with some form of problem-solving. Engineers, mechanics, and officers worked tirelessly to keep the vessel in fighting shape, always seeking to improve, to modify, to adapt. It was no longer a ship that just took punishment. It was one that learned from it, grew stronger with every wound it sustained. The Enterprise had become the Navy's primary laboratory for real-time wartime adaptation. Its ability to innovate under duress became its greatest weapon. But for all its innovation, there were limits to how far they could push. Every new solution was met with new challenges, and the ship's crew could sense the growing strain. How long could this cycle of improvisation continue? How long could they continue to innovate before their resourcefulness was pushed to its absolute limit? In the midst of this daily struggle, another challenge was looming, one that would demand even more from the Enterprise and its crew. As they prepared for the next phase of the war, they could not know that their greatest test was still ahead. It was the kind of moment where time seemed to stretch into eternity. Enterprise had already weathered countless storms, but now, amid the fierce battles of the Pacific, it was confronted by something even more brutal: the devastating power of direct, calculated assault. Major hits crippled the flight deck, leaving the mighty carrier listing and burning under the weight of enemy fire. The sound of explosions filled the air, the deck buckling as fires broke out in multiple areas, sending thick black smoke spiraling into the sky. In an instant, the Enterprise, which had once seemed invincible, became a wounded beast. Its decks broken, its body aflame, but its spirit, it seemed, unwilling to yield. Amid the chaos, damage control parties, despite being given orders to evacuate, refused to leave their posts. The men knew their mission: to fight the flames, to stop the ship from becoming a tomb, to keep the ship alive, no matter the cost. They worked tirelessly, battling fires with an intensity that mirrored the urgency of the situation. As the minutes stretched into hours, the heat of the flames and the smell of burning metal filled the air. But still, they did not falter. Every sailor knew that the Enterprise had been their home through countless trials, and now it was their turn to ensure that it survived. They would fight for the ship as they would for their comrades, unrelenting, determined, and driven by something greater than fear. In the midst of the flames, Japanese radio reports falsely claimed that the Enterprise had been sunk. Again. For the third time in the war, the mighty carrier was said to have been destroyed, reduced to wreckage on the seabed of the Pacific. But this was not the end of the Enterprise. As smoke continued to billow from its gutted flight deck, the carrier stabilized, still burning but undeniably alive. Against all odds, the ship remained afloat, its crew continuing to defy the expectation of its imminent demise. The Enterprise had become a symbol of resilience, its ability to stay afloat despite overwhelming damage a testament to the endurance of both ship and crew. Tugboats arrived, hauling the battered carrier toward repair docks, where crews would work tirelessly to return it to fighting shape. The men of the Enterprise had grown accustomed to hardship, but this was something new. The ship they had believed invincible was now something scarred, something tempered by fire. Yet even in the midst of its damage, the Enterprise had shown something far more powerful than just structural strength. It had demonstrated the will to survive. Sailors, exhausted and covered in soot, would recount their near-death moments with a quiet introspection that spoke volumes. There was no bravado, no triumphant boasting of their survival. Just a quiet understanding that they had faced death, and somehow, they had lived to tell the tale. As the Enterprise returned to the sea, scarred but not broken, it carried with it a new identity. It was no longer the ship that had simply been lucky. It was the ship that could not be killed, a floating testament to American willpower. Japan had thrown everything it could at the carrier, yet the Enterprise had emerged from the flames, harder and more determined than ever. It was no longer a symbol of a fleet. It was a symbol of defiance, of survival in the face of overwhelming odds. But what lay ahead for the Enterprise? Could the ship, battered and worn, continue to endure? Would the relentless tide of battle finally take its toll? Or would the Enterprise prove to be the one ship that simply could not be sunk? In the distance, beyond the horizon, the next battle loomed. And with it, another test for the ship that would not die. The Enterprise found itself once more in the heart of a campaign that would shape the fate of the Pacific, Guadalcanal. The island, a speck of land in the vast ocean, had become the epicenter of a struggle that would push both sides to the limits of endurance. For the Enterprise, this was a familiar rhythm. But now the stakes were even higher. The carrier, with its battle-hardened crew and unyielding reputation, was once again thrust into the fray. As night fell over the Pacific, it brought with it a new kind of warfare, one that would test the very limits of American doctrine and technology. The night engagements around Guadalcanal were unlike any the Americans had faced before. Darkness, the vast expanse of the Pacific, and the chaos of battle combined to create a scene where nothing could be predicted. Radar systems, still in their infancy, were tasked with guiding aircraft through the blackness, a primitive but necessary technology that became a lifeline in the absence of visual confirmation. The Enterprise's aircraft, launched into the inky night sky, were sent to strike at enemy positions beyond visual range, their targets hidden from sight. Pilots, relying on the crude radar and their training, carried out their missions with a quiet precision, their every move dependent on a technology still evolving. The uncertainty of the night, the lack of immediate feedback, made every strike feel like a calculated risk, but it was one the Enterprise's pilots were willing to take. They knew that failure was not an option. The survival of their comrades, their ship, and the campaign itself rested on their success. Meanwhile, Japanese forces, feeling the weight of American resistance, mounted desperate offensives to break the American foothold on Guadalcanal. They had underestimated the resolve of the American forces, but now their desperate push was a testament to the high stakes they faced. The battle for Guadalcanal had become a critical turning point, one where the momentum of the war could be decided. The Japanese had thrown everything they had into this offensive, but they were met with unwavering resistance. It was here that the Enterprise played its most pivotal role, striking at the heart of the Japanese supply chain. Its planes, guided by the radar systems that had been honed through trial and error, destroyed key Japanese transports, cutting off vital supplies and reinforcements. The Enterprise's strikes shifted the battlefield's direction, dealing a blow that would echo through the campaign. But this success came at a cost. The crews aboard Enterprise worked with a level of exhaustion that bordered on the surreal. Hours of sleep were luxuries few could afford. Their bodies were worn, their minds dulled by the constant pressure to perform, but their duty never wavered. They operated in a haze, caught between the overwhelming desire for rest and the knowledge that every second of delay could mean the difference between life and death. The ship, itself a symbol of endurance, was a reflection of the crew that manned it. Both had been forged in the fires of constant battle, both tested beyond the limits of what should have been possible. They fought not only for victory but for survival. for a future they could not yet see, but one they knew was worth fighting for. The battle for Guadalcanal was a microcosm of the larger conflict. It was a battle that would ultimately define the Pacific War. As the days wore on and the Enterprise continued to support the American forces, a shift was taking place. Guadalcanal was becoming the turning point, the place where the Japanese advance finally fractured. The momentum that had carried the Empire of Japan across the Pacific had begun to unravel. The Enterprise and its crew, through sheer will and relentless effort, had played a crucial role in that shift. They had helped turn the tide, even if the full weight of their contribution would not be understood until much later. The winds of war, which had once seemed to blow so favorably for the Japanese, were now shifting. Guadalcanal had become the moment when the tide turned. But as the Enterprise continued to fight on, the question remained. How long could this carrier, this ship that had defied every expectation, continue to endure? The challenges were far from over, and what lay ahead was unknown. In the distance, beyond the horizon, new dangers were already on the rise. As Enterprise steamed into the Philippine Sea in the summer of 1944, it was about to participate in one of the most decisive naval engagements of the war, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. Known later as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, the battle would become a watershed moment in the struggle for the Pacific. On one side, Enterprise and the American fleet, backed by veteran pilots and superior technology. On the other, Japan's remaining carriers, their aviators hastily trained and overmatched. The stakes could not have been higher. The Pacific War was at a tipping point, and this would be a battle that would test the very future of naval aviation. The skies over the Philippine Sea were filled with incoming waves of Japanese aircraft, desperate to break the American hold on the islands. But their pilots were no match for the seasoned American squadrons aboard Enterprise and the other carriers. The Japanese aviators, poorly trained and underprepared, launched into an attack they could not hope to win. They were met by a wall of American fighters, their precision and experience quickly evident in the sky. Enterprise's aircraft cut through the waves of attackers with a ferocity born from months of bitter combat. Each intercept was a masterstroke in coordination and skill. The American pilots, veterans of countless engagements, knew how to exploit the slightest opening, how to use the radar guidance systems to ensure their strikes were precise and overwhelming. The waves of Japanese aircraft faltered, and soon what had seemed like a coordinated attack turned into a desperate rout. At the heart of the American response was the radar-directed interception, an innovation that marked a leap in naval warfare. For the first time in history, American radar systems guided fighter planes into intercept positions with an accuracy that defied the vast expanse of the sea. It was a technological breakthrough that allowed Enterprise's fighters to strike at their enemies with unprecedented precision, cutting through the skies with a tactical awareness that no adversary had yet learned to counter. The shift from visual identification to radar-based interception wasn't just an advancement in technology. It was a profound shift in the nature of combat itself. The days of surprise attacks and chaotic dogfights were over. Now, warfare could be fought with an efficiency that would soon define the rest of the conflict. The impact of this battle on the Japanese forces was devastating. In a matter of hours, the once feared Japanese carrier aviation was crippled, its numbers and effectiveness shattered. The Marianas Turkey Shoot revealed, for all to see, the irreversible decline of Japan's once proud fleet. The pilots, unprepared for the ferocity and precision of American firepower, fell in waves, their carriers and aircraft sinking into the depths. Japan's naval power, built on its ability to project air power, had been fundamentally broken. The loss was not just tactical, it was strategic. Japan would never again hold the same advantage in the skies over the Pacific. For Enterprise and its crew, the battle marked a shift in their own legacy. No longer merely a symbol of survival, the Enterprise had now become an instrument of dominance. Its reputation had grown from that of a warship that endured unimaginable punishment to one that dictated the terms of the fight. The Enterprise wasn't just surviving anymore. It was defining the future of naval warfare. The carriers of the Pacific had become the weapon of choice, and Enterprise was at the forefront of this new era. The crew, exhausted but exhilarated, understood the significance of what had just transpired. The tide had not just turned in favor of the Americans, it had begun to run swiftly westward, toward Japan itself. The path to victory, though still long and uncertain, had become a more certain course. Enterprise had not only preserved the fleet, it had paved the way for future offensives that would soon bring the war to the very doorstep of Japan. Yet, even in the face of their triumph, a quiet question lingered. How long could they sustain this momentum? The Japanese had been dealt a crippling blow, but they were not finished. The war was far from over, and another storm was already gathering on the horizon. As the Enterprise sailed through the aftermath of the battle, the question was clear. What would the next chapter of this war hold for the ship that had come to symbolize both survival and dominance? As the Enterprise sailed into the heart of the Philippines campaign in October 1944, it found itself at the center of the largest naval battle in history, the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This was no longer just a conflict for territory. It was the final surge before Japan's naval capacity would collapse under the weight of its own desperation. The stakes were nothing short of existential as the American forces launched their massive invasion to retake the Philippines, a pivotal step in pushing the Japanese back to their home islands. For the Enterprise and its crew, this battle would become a test of everything they had endured up to that point. The arrival of kamikaze attacks, however, shifted the dynamics of the battle entirely. These suicidal strikes introduced a new, terrifying dimension to naval combat. The Enterprise's crew, hardened by years of war, suddenly faced a threat that could not be fought off with their usual tactics. The Japanese, in their final effort to hold back the American onslaught, had resorted to desperation. The kamikazes came in waves, driven by a hatred of the invader and a sense of duty that bound the pilots to a tragic fate. Each attack was a violent gamble, and it seemed that with every passing hour, the kamikaze threat grew more overwhelming. Their planes, laden with explosives, turned into missiles of death. The Enterprise, as a primary target, became the focus of wave after wave of these strikes. Despite this new nightmare, the Enterprise's defenses held for a time. The ship's anti-aircraft guns fired relentlessly, and its fighters scrambled into the sky, meeting the attackers head-on. But even the most coordinated defense could not stop every assault. The Enterprise endured repeated strikes that tore into its hull and deck, overwhelming its existing defenses. Bombs found their marks, leaving massive craters and fires that seemed unstoppable. The Enterprise was no stranger to damage, but these kamikaze attacks were something else entirely. The ship shuddered with each explosion, and its crew was forced to adapt once again to a war that was escalating in ways they had never imagined. The deck, once a place of routine flight operations, was now a battleground. But still, they fought on. In the face of this new kind of warfare, the ship's deck crews worked with a resolve that bordered on the heroic. Under the ever-present threat of further attacks, they kept operations running. The fires that raged on the ship were only one of many obstacles. The craters left by the kamikaze strikes were soon filled with the bodies of the fallen. Casualties mounted, yet the crew's determination never faltered. They moved through the chaos with grim precision, doing what was necessary to keep the Enterprise operational. No one spoke much of their fear. There was no time for it. There was only the ship, the fight, and the understanding that each day they survived brought them one step closer to victory. American strategy now focused on overwhelming air superiority, an approach that the Enterprise embodied. The ship's aircraft were integral in neutralizing Japanese surface forces attempting to break the American landing zones. They struck with surgical precision, targeting the Japanese fleet in a series of attacks that ultimately crippled Japan's ability to defend the Philippines. The Enterprise's role was pivotal in ensuring that the Japanese Navy could no longer contest the American invasion. Each strike, each mission, served to further weaken Japan's ability to respond. As the battle raged on, it became increasingly clear that the Japanese Navy's capacity to wage war at sea was drawing to an irreversible conclusion. Leyte Gulf marked the last desperate attempt of the Japanese to stop the tide of the Pacific War. Their naval forces, already devastated by months of attrition, faced a final, crushing blow. The battle would become the decisive turning point, the moment when Japan's once mighty fleet, once a force to be reckoned with, was finally broken. But for the Enterprise and its crew, The battle was not only about defeating the Japanese, it was about surviving a fight that seemed designed to push them beyond endurance. And though victory was now within reach, the question remained, how much longer could the Enterprise and its crew withstand this constant assault? They had weathered storms, and now they faced a new kind of enemy, one that struck from the air with no mercy, no warning. In the haze of smoke and fire, as the Enterprise kept moving forward, the crew knew they were approaching the end of one era and the beginning of another. What came next, however, was uncertain. The Enterprise had become a symbol of survival and resilience, but how long could it keep defying the odds? A storm was still brewing on the horizon. By 1945, Enterprise stood as a monument to the relentless cost of war. The once pristine hull, now battered by years of combat, bore the physical fatigue of a ship that had never known rest. The repairs grew longer, the time spent in dry dock increasingly occupied by the task of patching wounds that seemed endless. The ship's steel plates, once smooth and seamless, now revealed layers of scars, each a testament to the battles it had endured, the countless missions that had marked its surface. Where new carriers were being built with cutting-edge technology, Enterprise had become a relic in many ways, overshadowed by advances in speed, radar, and firepower. Yet no ship, no matter how advanced, could match its experience. The Enterprise had become the embodiment of endurance, its value not just in its weaponry, but in its ability to weather storms no other ship could withstand. The crew, too, had aged before their time. Their bodies, like the ship's, bore the marks of a war that had consumed their youth. Each face seemed more worn than the last, the eyes once bright with youthful ambition, now dulled by the weight of years spent at sea. The Enterprise had carried them through every phase of the Pacific War, through Pearl Harbor, Midway, the Solomon Islands, and more. Now, as the war neared its final stages, the men aboard knew the end was coming. Some could not bear the thought of it, while others, too exhausted to reflect, simply continued to do their duty. The Enterprise had been their world, and its fate was intertwined with theirs. They had come to understand that the journey had consumed more than just their youth. It had consumed their very identities. Even as the ship's aging hull continued to carry out its missions, Enterprise remained at the forefront of key operations, its planes providing air support from Iwo Jima to Okinawa. It had seen countless battles, yet each new operation felt like a step closer to the end. Each time the ship launched its aircraft into the sky, the crew knew that this might be their final push, the last time they would face such dire odds. Yet, there was no slowing down. The Enterprise was a warship, and it would fight until the last. Then, the unthinkable happened. A kamikaze attack. This time, it struck the Enterprise with a force that felt like an end. The impact crippled the carrier's flight deck, sending fire and debris in all directions. The ship, which had survived so much, now felt like it might be its last casualty. As the flames burned through the deck, it was as if the ship was taking its final breath. The damage was severe, the flight deck inoperable, and for a moment it seemed as though the Enterprise would be forced to retire from battle forever. But the Enterprise, like the men who served aboard her, was not so easily defeated. In the face of near destruction, it was withdrawn temporarily, no longer able to carry out its usual operations but still alive, still fighting. This attack pushed the Enterprise to the very limits of its endurance. The ship had weathered everything the Pacific could throw at it, but this final assault left it vulnerable in a way it had never been before. The crew, too, had reached the edge. They had given everything, and now the Enterprise lay still, waiting for repairs. The question loomed. Had they reached their breaking point? How much longer could this warship, this symbol of perseverance, continue to hold together? How much longer could the crew endure the weight of their shared history, a history written in fire and blood? As the ship waited for the repairs it so desperately needed, a quiet realization spread across the crew. The war was nearing its end, but Enterprise, like them, had been pushed beyond the limits. The final chapter was approaching, and no one could predict what awaited them next. The battle for survival, it seemed, was far from over. But what would the Enterprise have left to give after everything it had endured? Would this warship, at the edge of exhaustion, be able to fulfill its final purpose? In the summer of 1945, After years of bloodshed, Japan's resistance finally collapsed. The war, which had once seemed endless, was now drawing to a close. The Enterprise, having played a pivotal role in shaping the conflict, was at the cusp of the victory it had long been fighting for. Yet, as the war ended, the carrier found itself once again sidelined, undergoing repairs that would prevent it from participating in the final months of combat. It had been there from the beginning, through the flames of the Pacific, through the bitter struggles of Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond. But now, as the war's final chapters were written, the Enterprise was a silent observer, a ship that had seen it all but would not be present for the closing act. For the men who had served aboard it, the war's end came with a quiet weight. Victory in many ways was the culmination of years of sacrifice. But it was not a triumph. There were no grand celebrations or euphoric moments of conquest. Instead, there was a deep, lingering silence. The sailors who had survived the war reflected on their journey with a sense of paradox. They had endured, they had lived, but they had lost so much along the way. Friends, comrades, whole parts of themselves had been left behind in the battles of the Pacific. There was no exultation in the end, only the slow, quiet realization that they had come through it all, but at what cost? For the men of the Enterprise, victory felt hollow, as though they had won, yet in winning, they had been irrevocably changed. As the Enterprise completed its repairs, its role shifted. The ship that had once been a weapon of war, a carrier that had struck fear into the hearts of the enemy, now found itself on a new mission, escorting home thousands of American soldiers as part of Operation Magic Carpet. The carrier's decks, once filled with the noise of combat, now carried soldiers returning from the war, weary and broken, their faces tired but hopeful. The Enterprise, a ship that had endured so much, was now a bridge between the horrors of the battlefield and the promise of peace. Its mission had shifted from destruction to transport, from victory to the quiet return to ordinary life. The ship, battered yet resilient, was no longer a symbol of combat. It had become a symbol of transition, of the journey from war back to the world that awaited beyond it. As Enterprise sailed home, its legacy was quietly acknowledged. Admirals who had watched the carrier rise through the ranks of battle silently recognized the ship's unmatched record. 20 battle stars earned through years of service in the most brutal campaigns of the Pacific. The Enterprise had become more than just a warship. It had become a legend. Yet, as it glided through the Pacific waters on its final missions, there was no fanfare, no ceremony to mark its accomplishments. The Enterprise had completed its service, not in the fire and fury of combat, but in the humble transport of men who had fought and survived, just like it. In the years that followed, the Enterprise would fade from active duty, its place in history solidified, but its service complete. The carrier that had once carried the weight of the Pacific War, that had endured and adapted to the harshest conditions, would soon fade into the annals of history. But for those who had served aboard her, the Enterprise would never be just a ship. It had been a companion through years of hardship, a symbol of their survival, and ultimately, a quiet reminder of the toll that victory had exacted. As the ship's final days in the Pacific came to an end, the question lingered: what would become of the ship that had witnessed the turning points of history? Would its legacy be defined by its battles, or by the quiet service that followed? The Enterprise had fought for so much, but now, in peace, it seemed that its greatest challenge would be to fade away, leaving behind only memories of a war that had changed the world. The Enterprise had completed its mission. But as it sailed into the horizon, another chapter of history was already beginning, one that would be shaped by a different kind of struggle, in a world that was learning to rebuild after the storm of war. After the war, when peace finally began to settle over the Pacific, the Enterprise, the ship that had become a symbol of resilience and victory, was faced with an unexpected fate. Despite its unparalleled service record, the Enterprise was doomed to be scrapped. Post-war budgets, stretched thin by the rebuilding of the nation, had little room for relics of war. Though petitions from the public and veterans poured in, urging that the ship be preserved as a national monument, the call was ultimately ignored. The government's decision to decommission the Enterprise, the most decorated American warship in history, was a quiet reminder of how swiftly the tides of history can change. The ship that had once stood at the forefront of every major battle in the Pacific now faced an ignominious end, not at the hands of an enemy, but at the hands of bureaucracy. Veterans, the very men who had fought aboard her, watched in silence as the Enterprise was slowly erased from the naval register. It was a painful process, the end of a legacy that had defined much of their lives. The ship that had carried them through the darkest days of the war, the ship that had endured more than any could have imagined, was now destined to be dismantled. The loss was more than just the physical ship, it was the loss of the spirit of those who had sailed aboard it, of the shared history that had shaped their lives. As Enterprise disappeared from the fleet, so too did a piece of the men who had served aboard her. The ship's farewell was a quiet, unceremonious event, overshadowed by the demands of the post-war world. But while the Enterprise was fading from the naval registry, its legacy was far from over. In the decades that followed, historians and military strategists turned their attention to its operations, studying the techniques, innovations, and sacrifices that had defined its service. The Enterprise had played a key role in shaping the way naval aviation would evolve during the Cold War. Its use of radar-guided intercepts, its innovative methods for maintaining readiness under fire, and its ability to adapt to new types of warfare became cornerstones of modern carrier doctrine. The ship that had been such a vital instrument of victory was now quietly influencing the future, its lessons continuing to guide the development of the Navy's carriers for generations to come. The impact of the Enterprise's legacy cannot be overstated. The techniques and innovations that had been born out of necessity during the heat of battle, fighting against overwhelming odds, maintaining a fleet's strength despite crippling losses, became the foundation of modern naval aviation. The resilience demonstrated by the crew in the face of unimaginable pressure shaped the training and philosophy of future naval officers. Every battle, every skirmish, had left a mark not just on the ship itself, but on the doctrine that would govern American naval power for decades. The lessons learned from Enterprise's service were distilled into the very fabric of modern naval warfare. Today, in museums across the United States, artifacts from the Enterprise stand as silent witnesses to what the ship endured. Displayed behind glass, these remnants of a bygone era, tools, flight manuals, uniforms, and other relics, serve as solemn reminders of the sacrifices made by the men who sailed her. They are reminders of a ship that not only survived but defined an era. The Enterprise's legacy is now embedded in the history of the U.S. Navy, in the very structure of the military it helped shape. Its story is told not just in the names of sailors and battles, but in the doctrines that still guide the Navy's actions today. What the Enterprise ultimately became was more than just a warship. It was a story of survival, shaped by chance, ingenuity, and an unrelenting will to continue. Its reputation as the most decorated carrier in history became a symbol of something larger: the resilience of those who served aboard it, the lessons learned in the heat of battle, and the ability to adapt in the face of relentless adversity. It was a ship born of war, yet its legacy lived on in peace. The Enterprise had been called the most dangerous American warship of the war. Time, in the end, proved them right.